Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, the psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Michael Morris. Michael is a cultural psychologist at Columbia University in its Graduate School of Business and its psychology department. Previously, he taught for a decade at Stanford University. He's published over 200 articles in leading behavioral science and management journals on topics such as decision-making, social judgment, negotiation, and social networks. Outside of academia, Dr. Morris advises corporations, government agencies, NGOs, and political campaigns about culture-related issues. His new book is called Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together, and was the topic of our discussion. One key takeaway from our discussion was a deep awareness of the contrast between the environment of early human ancestors and today's world. The human brain evolved to function effectively in a tribal environment. This would include small bands of related family and peers, but also distant groups with a shared culture. Unfortunately, there are many modern environments that don't reflect this way of living. Many people in big cities live alone in high-rises, which can feel isolating. And even though they are often surrounded by people, strangers do not elicit the same sense of group membership and comfort as an early human tribe. Moreover, our brains are not fine-tuned to operate effectively in the digital communities of today. While these communities contribute to our desire to connect with others, they lack a physical presence, which can make it harder to establish a sense of camaraderie and interdependence. And the asynchronous nature can also meddle with our ability to communicate clearly and develop stable bonds. Another interesting takeaway is that history has given us a blueprint on how to effectively change culture. When you signal to others that an idea is popular, especially amongst those in higher status, and you appeal to the primitive desire to honor past traditions, you can generate the cultural shifts necessary to address societal ills. If you associate our evolutionary history of living in tribes as an explanation for why we are in constant conflict with one another, you may be surprised at some of the insights that Michael has to offer. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Michael Morris. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Michael wrote a book called Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. So we're going to be talking about culture quite a bit today. Why don't we start by defining culture and by putting culture in the context of other things that might influence human behavior, right? So there are lots of things that influence our thoughts, our behaviors, things like our personal experience, our genetics. But specifically, how does culture fit in relative to those other large influences?
Great question. Culture, in the broadest definition that I use, is the shared knowledge within a community that holds it together and enables coordination and cooperation and continuity. Other primates are also social animals that have communities, like chimpanzee troops, but these communities are held together by the ties of kinship and friendship or bonding. And culture enables our kind to transcend the limitations of kith and kin and form much larger communities that other primates are incapable of. You get more than 50 or 60 chimpanzees in a troop, and it starts to break down into a clash of violent factions against each other. Um, a chimpanzee Manhattan with millions of people on a small island would be impossible.
Yeah, it was very interesting to see you compare uh, culture in humans and how different uh, what our culture provides us compared to these to chimps and even other species like ants. I think people have a tendency to craft the conversation around how much we have in common with animals and how much we have in common with early human ancestors. But in the book, you kind of draw this distinction and say, you can say that chimpanzees are social, but it's night and day compared to the capabilities that humans demonstrate. Could you talk a little bit more about well, let's just say, for example, coordinating, social coordination. What are some interesting differences between how humans would coordinate behavior versus chimpanzees?
Well, in other social animals like wolves or chimpanzees, there's a sense in which they seem to be collaborating when they're hunting. Um, and there's something that's called sort of mutualism, which is that if I'm hunting side by side with you and we're both trying to catch lizards, let's just say, um, I may spook some lizards who then run out right in front of you and you can scoop them up, and vice versa. Um, but I'm not doing it intentionally with a shared plan that you also hold. Um, if I'm a chimpanzee, because they don't have the cognitive and communicative chops to kind of express an idea like you go over there and then I'll send. It's more just that I'm following my, evolved, programs for how to hunt, and you're following yours. And the fact that I'm near you happens to have a benefit. Sometimes it'll have a cost, but sometimes it'll have a benefit. And what is different once, it used to be that we thought that early humans like Homo erectus were intellectually more ape than human because
Mhm.
they didn't make many tools. They were around for nearly a million years and they made one tool, the hand axe, which is a teardrop shaped piece of flint that's sharpened on one side, and they used it as a chopper, smasher, cutter, and so it's this kind of incredible technological stasis. They weren't building many tools or inventing many tools. And it was thought that they were not living very differently than chimpanzees live. But what has come out in some recent archaeological discoveries, and the field of archaeology now uses all of these CSI worthy techniques. It used to be just looking at the bones and stones, and the bones and stones are not, they're just the remnants of prior humans that survive. They may have had a lot of wooden tools. They may have made things out of leather. Well, we don't,
Right.
those didn't survive. It doesn't,
Mhm.
the fact that we don't see them doesn't mean that they weren't there. And now they use all of these lab techniques where they'll take soil samples, from this strata and soil samples from that strata and bring the soil back to the lab and look at it under a microscope and treat it with chemicals. And they can learn a tremendous amount, from the biological components of the soil that not visible to the naked eye and not something that classical Indiana Jones type archaeologists, were able to use. But they've been able to discover, say, from some fossilized footprints that have been discovered, that there's evidence of a sort of coordinated hunting party 1.5 million years ago, where you have antelope tracks and then you have a variety of human tracks, a group of young males moving they can tell from the tracks that people were moving at a fast pace and moving along the side of a lake rather than towards a lake, which, so that indicates it's not people coming for water, it's tracking prey along a lake. And what is thought to be going on there is a technique called persistence hunting, where you and I and maybe another hunter, we crouch together and we see, okay, here's one antelope that's a little bit on the margins of the herd. One of us will run down and chase it and try to separate it from the herd even more. Then another one who's been waiting will then start to chase it. And then a third one, will be ready to start chasing. And antelopes evolved to be sprinters, not marathoners. Lions don't charge all day, so they they can outrun any human. They can sprint like 50 miles an hour, but after sprinting two, three, four times, they just get overwhelmed and they get overheated and dehydrated and they just
Hmm.
collapse. So it it requires coordination. It requires that we can agree on which antelope we're going to chase and who's gonna go in what order, and I'm gonna chase it towards where I know you're waiting. Um, and chimpanzees can't do anything like that. Chimpanzees are very because they can't share a common intention. Chimpanzees can't point things out to each other. They
Right.
can point if like they see food and they want food, they may reach towards the food. But what they can't do is if there are berries behind you that you're unaware of, they can't uh, point it out to you and say, Ryan, you
Mm.
might be hungry. There are berries behind you, because they don't have a theory of mind that's developed well enough to know that while they know the berries are there, that you don't know, and that the act of pointing would inform you to look and then discover that there are berries there. So,
Yeah,
one reason
it's a
they
real
can't.
subtle distinction too. I mean, this idea of a chimp might be able to follow an eye gaze, but as humans we're like, oh, they're communicating, they're inside this this invisible part of communicating inside our heads. They're thinking, they're communicating, they're trying to get the attention of the other chimpanzee, but it's the only reason we interpret it as advanced social communication is because we know that that's what we're doing to a certain
Right.
extent when
No,
we do
you're
that.
right.
Right.
There's a tendency to anthropomorphize
Right.
what other primates are doing, and I think that the relevant sciences, have gone back and forth about the degree to which chimpanzees have theory of mind, in part because there's this temptation, to kind of look at selective videotapes and say, oh, clearly they're forming a shared intention here. But then there'll be a conservative movement saying, hey, we don't really know that. Just as in the literature on teaching language to other primates, there have been optimistic periods and then more pessimistic periods. But just as they can't engage in I think what's called indexical pointing, where I'm pointing to inform you of something. Chimps are very inventive. They are constantly discovering like new ways to, get the termites from the ground that they like to eat, or to knock fruit from a tree branch that they can't reach. But they're not very collaborative. So if one chimp in a troop discovers a new way of knocking fruit from a tree, others may observe it, but when they try to imitate it, they imitate it very crudely. It becomes like a game of telephone where, I see you're doing something with a stick, so I pick up a stick, but I'm not using the stick in the way that you are using it. Maybe you're using it to create, more intense shaking, and I'm just whacking, I'm just waving the stick
Right.
around. And maybe I'll get one banana, and then somebody who sees me doing it, they will do a crude imitation of what I did. And once it
Hmm.
gets past two or three people, it's no longer the same stick trick that
Right.
the original person came up with. Whereas humans can engage in this high fidelity imitation because when we observe another person, we don't just see the motor movements. We immediately see what they're trying to do, like what
Yeah.
the intention is, what the method is. And we read minds that way, and it allows for better fidelity imitation of actions, of
Hmm.
skills, so we can transfer skills very quickly within a group. And so chimpanzees, are constantly like dragging logs around because if they move a log, they can get the termites or other grubs underneath the log. But what never happens in a chimpanzee troop is, even though many people may be trying to move a log and not able to, or two people are moving their own logs, it never happens that two chimpanzees work together to move a log that's too big for one of them to move.
Interesting.
Never
Yeah.
happens. They just can't, figure that one out. So they don't coordinate at a very high degree. The kind of coordination, the collaboration that seems to happen is sort of accidental.
Hmm. So, you mentioned culture is essentially shared knowledge, and so if culture is shared knowledge, there has to be methods of sharing. You mentioned language as one of these features that allows humans to share knowledge. But in the book, you talk about other sort of features or building blocks of culture. Could you talk about some of these important features of culture that allow for this shared knowledge process?
Yeah. So, when evolutionary anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists, discuss the many adaptations, that define our species' social behavior. They may slice it into 50 different, fine-grained adaptations, but I'm someone who has taught most of my career in graduate schools of business, teaching practical people what they can take away from uh, what social scientists have learned about culture. And I've found it useful to distinguish three major waves of evolution as three basic instincts. And I use the concept of tribal instincts, which there's a pair of evolutionary anthropologists, Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson. They have introduced a term in some of their writing, tribal instincts, which they distinguish from the primate instincts that precede them. So
Hmm.
the idea of, helping kin is something that primates also have. And so that's a more fundamental social instinct. But the tribal instincts are human specific. And
Hmm.
sometimes, the tribal instincts come into conflict with these more basic instincts, and that's kind of part of what Freud wrote about in, civilization and its discontents, that we may have part of us wants to do this, but another part of us, feels that we ought to do this. And so we're not a perfectly aligned machine. But these three waves of social instincts that distinguish our species and enable tribal living, our particular form of social life, living in large groups that are glued together by shared knowledge. The first of them is the peer instinct. And this corresponds to what we might call conformist tendencies in our information processing and in our behavior. We are wired to pay attention to those around us, the other people around us, and to internalize the regularities of our group, without even trying to. So we automatically have a sense of what's normal, what the normal response for the group that we belong to is.
Hmm.
And we belong to many groups, and we have different sets of norms, associated with those different groups. And we are motivated to follow those norms, particularly when we are in the presence of fellow members of a particular group. We feel an intrinsic motivation to mesh with these other people and
Hmm.
to match what they're doing. And we still feel this in our life today. We have this subconscious, motivation, this impulse to see what our classmates are doing, see what our neighbors are doing, see what our coworkers are doing, and get on the same page with them.
Hmm.
And
And
that
even
is
in
something we all.
modern examples, it's kind of interesting because I talk to my students a lot, and you get this sense that social anxiety has become more prevalent now than it ever was. And I wonder oftentimes, like, if you start to scratch the surface, there is kind of this evolutionary piece where, what motivates social anxiety? Well, part of it is very natural that if you were to be awkward, if in one interaction with this tribe, if you did something awkward, uh, perhaps the tribe would ostracize you, and that would be devastating towards both your survival and your ability to reproduce. So, you say that, and I start thinking like, I wonder if there's if it suggests that this intense fear of being doing something stupid in public places or in groups, if that's just a normal part of human psychology, just kind of overextending.
I think you put your finger on it, that we have these systems that we're adaptive and probably are adaptive in a sort of normal social environment to enable the smooth functioning and the communication and the mutual understanding of people. But that doesn't mean that they don't operate dysfunctionally in environments that have somehow shifted. And I don't know if you've ever had John Haidt on the show, but his book, The Anxious Generation, is probably the most influential social psychology book that's ever been written. And I haven't, I don't know all of John's latest arguments, but to me, it makes sense that if teens' social observation becomes primarily, you know, platform based, Instagram,
Hmm.
these Facebook, these TikTok. The problem is that you're seeing this excessively curated uh, behavior and these excessively curated images that have often been through, mechanical filters, but that are, selected from the best angle with the best camera. Um, and it becomes an impossible standard to live up to because it's not reality. And if people are spending 4 hours a day looking at their phone, and only 5 hours a day looking at real people in
That they can
ordinary
interact with,
situations.
right? Mm.
Yeah, so the sort of get with the program anxiety that is wired into us becomes overwhelming because we're looking at a program that nobody can get with, and so
Well, and also, I try to remind my students that uh, our brains are wired to deal with specific sizes of groups, which you kind of highlight in your book as this tribal setting or tribal environment. We're not meant to be alone exclusively. That kind of explains why even the strongest of introverts or the strongest of hermits will go insane if they don't have any sort of social interaction. Uh, but the world we live in today, normally our early human ancestors, if we heard information about someone, it was probably important to us because information was only contained within the tribe. You're not getting a ton of information about tribes on the other side of the landmass. You're only getting, there's a perfect sync between a piece of information that is important or immediate to you.
Mm.
And then now, people wonder why we're so stressed out about having information fed through notifications, or we get so bogged down in reading the news, it's because there's a disconnect there in the sense that we're reading about something that's happening in populations that we have basically no control over. And it's not surprising that we get sort of bent out of shape or we have excess negative emotions around that, because our information is coming from tribes that are just so distant and so different from us that we can't actually change. We don't have any interaction with that group.
Yeah, it's really true in the conditions where we evolved. If the information reaches me, then I know that it's relevant. And if it
Right.
doesn't reach me, then I know that it's not relevant. It's like now yeah, it's like we spend so much time just trying to filter, what information to take in and what to ignore, because we have this fire hose of information, most of which is irrelevant. And yeah, the one insight about tribal living that sometimes gets lost, a lot of times people want to reduce tribal psychology to us and them, and the idea that there's sort of this one group that you're a part of, and then one enemy group that you're always, worried
Right.
about. That's really not central to what tribal psychology is. Tribal psychology is living in nested groups. So even in hunter-gatherer societies today, like, sort of the Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert, or the Aceh people in Paraguay, um, people live in bands, which are groups of people who forage together and, reside together in a camp together. And that is usually several dozen people. It's like a couple families. And it's the closest group, and people tend to be somewhat related to each other and to, coordinate everything they do within the band. And then the bands tend to be composed of people from the same clan. And the clan is often a group of people. Uh, Dunbar became famous for arguing that it's 150 people, but it's sort of the group of people that we regard to be as having a common ancestor and being associated with a particular territory. And in most hunter-gatherer societies, the bands are fluid. So, the bands will compose themselves, and it's almost like picking teams. And then
Mhm.
you kind of go off in a nomadic way, hunting and gathering, and then you return every now and then to, where the clan meets up. And then people can change bands, and people can, bands can merge together or whatever, and depending on the time of the year. And these clans are also connected in a broader network that we call a tribe. And the broader network of the tribe is other groups that maybe live in the same region and that have the same language or closely related languages, and they have at least an overlap of rituals, basic, greeting rituals or ways of showing respect, that kind of thing. And it was once thought that, hunter-gatherer people and our evolutionary ancestors knew only the immediate band of people that they hunt and gather with at a particular point in time. But as anthropologists have gotten more sophisticated in the way that they use social network analysis and, tracking over a longer time period individuals, they've recognized that, okay, what seems to be an isolated band, it's part of this clan, and it is part of this broader family of people who speak mutually comprehensible languages. So this three-part structure is pretty broadly observable across, all of the indigenous peoples that have been studied. And Dunbar has been a big proponent for this way of thinking, and a lot of others don't agree that the number 150 is exactly Right. He was very
Mhm.
good at finding examples of historical groups that all seem to show up at around 150, but other ways of doing the analysis show clans being larger than that. But basically, there's sort of a clan level, and that's sort of everyone who you might know. You might know them and have a history of interaction with them, or at least recognize them as an individual. But then tribes transcend that because it's people who are total strangers who might wander into your territory. You have no idea who they are. You've never seen them before, but maybe some of the jewelry they wear is recognizable to
Right.
you in its style, and some of the language they speak you can understand, and they may have a slightly different, religious belief, but they know how to show respect, or they know how to greet you, and that is tremendously was tremendously important, to have these broader connections because tribes they they share mates across groups. Um, they share resources, including like different types of stone that are used for tool making. And they share ideas. And so when you're embedded within a tribe, you have access to this broader pool of shared knowledge than people who are not embedded in a tribe. And there are a lot of theories about, what happened in Europe 40, 50,000 years ago, where you had this other human species, Neanderthals, who had been thriving for hundreds of thousands of years in Europe and physically were very well adapted to Ice Age Europe. What happened to them? And until the last decade or so, when we can do ancient DNA analysis, it wasn't clear whether sapiens and Neanderthals ever met because the population density was low, and where you see clear sapiens, uh, remains or traces, those are different sites than where you see
Right.
the Neanderthal ones. But we now know that they not only met, but they mated, at least to some extent, because, 1 or 2% of our DNA is Neanderthal derived. And uh, but what we can see doing ancient DNA analysis and other things is that Neanderthals may have been just as fit as individuals, maybe more fit as individuals. They actually had larger brains than sapiens, and they were stronger. They were stocky and sturdy and had a bigger muscle structure. But they had a different social pattern. We can see in Neanderthal bones more evidence for battle, meaning that they kind of fought with neighboring groups. More evidence for cannibalism. You see like human bones with human tooth marks, on
Hmm.
them, which is
Right.
a clear indication of what happened. And they're more inbred. You can look at the level of inbreeding by doing DNA analysis in the remains of the different people in a group. So sapiens from 40,000 years ago are no more inbred than people from a European village nearby today, you know. And that's because they had started to have this outmating pattern, where different different clans came together for ritual celebrations, and mates were exchanged, and then people went off to live with other groups than the ones that they grew up with. And you see in Sapiens tool making, uh, they only used local stone. So if they lived in an area where there was granite, you'll see that their tools are from granite that was
Hmm.
quarried nearby. And archaeologists now can detect from radioactivity patterns where any piece of stone was quarried. And what they observe in the Sapien sites is what they call exotic stone. It's stone that was quarried hundreds of miles away. And no one was walking hundreds of miles in those days. And so it suggests that, useful stone that was rare was traded across groups. Um, you also see seashell jewelry in groups hundreds of miles from the ocean, using seashells that come from the ocean. So this indicates, kind of this exchange of raw materials, physical resources across sapiens groups within a broad region. And if they were exchanging those things and they were also exchanging mates, we can be pretty sure that they were exchanging some ideas. And we also see evidence more recently, but way before the agricultural revolution, of sapiens coming together for large scale temple building and for large scale burials, princely burials of people who must have been important people. And so that is just an indication of the connectedness of sapiens as opposed to Neanderthals. And that's considered to be probably why sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals, that we had an advantage that came from being tapped into these broader pools of knowledge.
Now, going back to these key three instincts that you mentioned, so we've discussed this kind of peer instinct where you're paying attention to what the group is doing, you're conforming to a certain extent.
Mhm.
But obviously, if it was only about conformity, you'd never see any innovation or growth.
Mm.
As you mentioned, diversity of the tool materials is kind of contributes to the success of the species. There has to be something that goes beyond conforming,
Mhm.
where an individual has to seek some other. There has to be some other motive,
Mhm.
because otherwise you would just have a stagnant group.
And
Um,
that's what Homo erectus was. It was a group that thrived, and it was around for a million years. Sapiens, we're only at about 300,000. Right? So it survived and thrived, but with extreme stasis in terms of its mode of life. Just one tool in a million years. And that's because, the peer instinct enabled teamwork, it enabled coordination, but it didn't enable innovation. And so what we see about half a million years ago in another human species, Homo heidelbergensis, which had, a slightly larger brain and they were slightly more upright, um, they had social behaviors that were a little different. Um, they were doing things that were normative, not just normal. They were doing things that were pro-social. And we can see this in the archaeological record. This is around the time when you start to see skeletons of people who were born with a congenital deformity but survived to the age of adulthood. And that tells us that somebody was taking care of another person who probably was not able to reciprocate that. So somebody was doing it because it was good for the group. We also see tools making a big step forward, things like throwing spears, which are complicated to make. You have to find the right wood, you have to straighten the wood, you have to, find, the right kind of quartz or shale, you have to sharpen it, you have to then haft the spearhead onto the shaft using some kind of twine. And somebody had to toil a long time with delay of gratification in order to make a spear that could fly straight and work to bring down large game like a woolly mammoth. But around this time, we start to see these advanced tools and we start to see that, humans moved to the top of the food chain. They were bringing down woolly mammoths and rhinos and elephants and other creatures that the version of those species that existed at that time are sometimes called megafauna because they're in many cases much larger than their contemporary cousins. The cave bears were like 12 feet high, and the mammoths were larger than the elephants today. So all these things changed, and they're all signs that people were acting in a way that required a personal sacrifice in order to contribute something to the greater good of the community, to the clan. And it's thought that, well, why were they doing that? Well, because the clan rewards contributors. And we can see evidence from that even in like hunter-gatherer tribes that were long thought to be free of hierarchy, like for example, the Kalahari Bushmen. They engage in this elaborate ritual called insulting the meat, where when hunters come back from a hunt, if one hunter has killed an antelope, um, the old men and women in the village will say, "What is that, a mouse? It's so scrawny that we should feed it instead of eating." They kind of engage in all of this, sarcasm to try to make sure that the hunter who was successful doesn't get a big head. And that's a status leveling ritual that is important in a small group where everyone has to live in a pretty similar way. But the mistake was to think that there is no status. And more contemporary anthropologists who use biological methods, they will do genetic tests and analyze, okay, which of the hunters we've been tracking over the last 20 years has the most offspring. And surprise, surprise, it's the ones who are the successful hunters. So, if if these hunters took the insults seriously,
Right.
there would be a real incentive problem for the group. Nobody would be expending the energy to actually be successful as a hunter, really chasing down these antelope and really, doing all the work to drag it back to the village. But what happens is what we can recognize in our society, which is there's a status leveling ritual of, don't get such a big head just because you are the successful hunter. But people still remember who was the successful hunter, and they get mating opportunities, and probably other social rewards that aren't accorded to other people. So these hunter-gatherer cultures are somewhat egalitarian and socialist. Many of them, for example, distribute food according to need, but there's evidence that medical care is given disproportionately to the individuals who are the key warriors or the key
Right.
hunters of the group, because it, the group has a real interest in keeping those people alive. So, the bottom line here, the genetic studies show that in every group you can compute a measure of status. For the Bushmen, it might be successful hunts. For an agricultural group, it might be crops or something like that. And there is a correlation between the status ordering in a group and the reproductive success of the individuals in the group. And it's pretty much the same size in these surface egalitarian groups as it is in other kinds of social organization like kingdoms or chiefdoms where the status is much more marked, socially and much more explicit. So status exists everywhere, and status is an engine for innovation because you gain the esteem and the tribute from a group by contributing to the group beyond what other people have contributed. And that means that you have to first understand what the group values and then try to find new ways to deliver it.
I
And
see.
it's not just that these instincts were new motivations, but there are cognitive capacities, learning capacities that have to come along with it. So, in the peer instinct, there's a drive to conform, but there's also a cognitive capacity to compute what is the norm here. It's not that hard, but you can kind of just sample what most people are doing and keep track of that. Okay, that's the norm. For the hero instinct, what they had to learn was what is appreciated by most of the people in this community. And for some things like, well, a successful hunt, not too hard to figure out. But for other things, like in terms of adhering to cultural norms, or that sort of behavior, you have to kind of figure out what is what is admired by most people in the group. And the learning heuristic that seems to have evolved and be a really important part of our tribal wiring is what's called prestige learning, which is that we look to the individuals in our community who are accorded the most prestige. Prestige is the most informal kind of status.
Hmm.
Positive attention is a currency, and some members of the
Hmm.
group receive more of it than most. And we can track that by tracking gaze, by tracking who gets deference, who gets an admiring look. And that means that we know the status ordering in our group. We know who gets the most admiration and who gets the least. And so we look to the distinctive qualities and the distinctive behaviors of those with prestige, or other forms of status, if other forms of status exist. And we try to emulate those things. Now, that leads to some superstitious learning in the present, where we learn what LeBron James eats for breakfast, and we start eating that for breakfast. We learn that an admired politician wears boxers instead of briefs, and we think we should buy boxers instead of briefs. But it also leads to some adaptive innovation and some adaptive cultural evolution. If, for example, a group migrates to a drier climate and they have a custom of planting beans, but somebody decides, oh, let me try planting sweet potatoes. And the person who planted sweet potatoes has a better crop than the people who've been planting beans, but as usual. Well, more people in the rising generation will try to emulate, okay, what made this person successful? Okay, well, they're planting something different. Well, let me emulate that. And then you have a sort of gradual shift in the population towards the behavior that is adaptive in the current environment, whether because they've migrated or because it's an ice age or whatever. But the hero instinct tendency, which when Elizabeth Holmes emulates the black turtlenecks that Steve Jobs wore, or the meditation practices of Steve Jobs, or the macrobiotic diet of Steve Jobs, we laugh at it and we say, how ridiculous. That didn't help Theranos be successful. But we don't know what it is that makes a given person
Right.
successful. So as a heuristic, emulate what's distinctive about this person who's been very successful. It often leads to success, and it often helps a group evolve towards what's currently going to be successful. So that's the
Hmm.
second instinct, and it's sort of the progressive force in our tribes that leads us to break away from just conformity. Um, and
So,
then
so uh, s- I want to continue on this idea of balancing the hero instinct and the peer instinct. Um, but I want to bring it into today's world for a moment, because all of these all of these hallmarks of culture and principles and instincts and methods of signaling, um, they all have a lot of implications for current, today's life. If you look today as an example, it seems like our political affiliation has become the dominant tribal classification. Of course, there's lots of different groups you can categorize people into, but having just under or went through an election, it's very salient, this division between the political parties. Um, Knowing what we know about how tribes operate and what helps them succeed and continue, um, what can we take from our early human ancestry to apply to creating more unity amongst the population of the U.S.?
what can we so based on all of the tribal instincts, what can we do to create unity and solidarity? Um, well, I think all three of the instincts are our instincts for solidarity, for building in-group communities. And I think it's a misconception that our tribal wiring is primarily about hostility towards them. I think, the frictions with other groups can arise from our tribal impulses, but that's not because we're wired for hostility. It's because the flourishing of one group sometimes externalities for another group. Uh, so I guess the question would be what, we've just come out of an election where, both parties were trying to build solidarity in a base and attract new members to the base. And a lot of people in my social circle are surprised by the outcome. And people in other parts of the country are not surprised by the outcome. Um, what is, Trump and his advisors ran a campaign that resonated at a very visceral level for a lot of people. And he engaged in old-fashioned populism, divisive populism, where you make reference to the good old days, the long ago good time lost, the halcyon days of yore, which are often described in a way that is slightly fictional, where the time when everyone was prosperous and everyone was united. I don't know if historians would agree that there was such a time, but in our nostalgia, it exists. And when we focus on that, we then feel a sense of loss looking at the current troubled times. And we have a clear idea about who to blame, which is newcomers, whether it's a new immigrant group or it's some new identity category that we don't remember being around before. And so it's it's a divisive technique of motivating people to feel a narrowing of the in group and feeling a sense that something's been taken from them by some out group, usually minorities of some kind. And that's not the only way that tribal psychology can be harnessed by politicians. There have always been politicians who used populist references to harness tribal psychology for unity, for building new coalitions. An example that I like to cite this time of year is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln took over in 1860 with less than 40% of the popular vote. 7 states seceded before he even was inaugurated. The Civil War was looming. More states seceded after the inauguration. You often hear things like Americans have never been more divided politically. Nonsense. We have been a lot more divided politically than the current red-blue rift, which is um, and it's interesting, how did Lincoln, who many regarded as incapable, this unpolished frontier upstart, how would he handle the nuances of diplomacy that were needed to, bring the Union back together? Well, in his first inaugural, he uttered these very cryptic lines. He said, "The mystic chords of memory will once again swell the chorus of the Union." I might have botched a few words. What did he mean by that? Well, he had this faith that collective memory, our memory as a nation of our common ancestors, and the feeling of obligation, the feeling of gratitude that we have, the feeling of obligation to maintain the ways of the past, that tribal instinct, which I call the ancestor instinct, was a strong enough force that it would ultimately get people beyond the disagreement of the present. And one way that he did that is in his speeches in the Gettysburg Address. He started by saying, 407 years ago, our fathers came to this land to da 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 da. So the idea is we should think about our common ancestors, think about their intention, and try to live up to their traditions. And something that we don't give Lincoln credit for is shortly before the Gettysburg Address in 1863, he issued the Thanksgiving Proclamation, where he asked Americans to set aside the last Thursday of November as a national holiday of remembrance and gratitude, for thinking about ancestors and, thinking about our community and our togetherness. And when he, and there were, it wasn't his idea. There were various thought leaders of the time, including a woman named Mary Josepha Hale, who was an editor and a poet and who had the idea that the country was becoming very divided through the 1850s and 1860s. And she had been campaigning for the idea that we needed a new national holiday that was a holiday sort of about togetherness. And she thought that a Thanksgiving holiday that referenced the Puritan traditions going back to the Pilgrims, um, and would be a unifying event. And Lincoln was smart enough as a lawyer to understand that if you want people to accept something as legitimate, you have to give them precedence for it. So he knew that George Washington, after the Revolutionary War, had a one-time Thanksgiving, which was a day of prayer. That's what Thanksgiving meant to Puritans. The Pilgrims did not regard their harvest feast as a Thanksgiving. They regarded it as a rejoicing. They were drinking whiskey and shooting off guns, and it was, and the Native Americans arrived just because they heard the guns going off and they wanted to see what was going on. They weren't invited. That. So there's a lot of historical reconstruction about exactly what that event was and what the intentions behind it were. And the two Puritan holidays or rituals, rejoicing and Thanksgiving, kind of became merged together in the American imagination. But Lincoln was smart enough to, issue a proclamation alluding to these pilgrim things that have been present for centuries and alluding to what George Washington had done 90 years before. And George Washington was the peak of legitimacy, in both to Northerners and Southerners. And the result was that this new routine, which for most of Americans was completely alien. People in New England knew what Thanksgivings were, but people in the South, their harvest was at a completely different time of year. Their crop, they didn't know what cranberries were. It was all new to them. But within a decade, it had become accepted not just as a comforting autumn routine, but as a sort of sacred tradition. Something that defined Americans, and people thought that their ancestors had always done it. So it became a tradition retrospectively, what's called the invention of tradition. And it helped the country come together because you knew that all of your compatriots were sitting down to the same menu on the same day. Even if the actual harvest was, at a different time in the East and the West and the North and the South. So it created this common national identity, that helped the country, reconstruct its national identity after the Civil War. So to me that's an inspiring story to remember because it suggests that the political crisis that we face today is not as bad as things that we've come through before, and that tribalism is not just a contribution to the problem. It can also be part of the solution. That our strong instincts for community and our our strong sense of connection to the past and our curiosity about the past, it can be leveraged for this kind of divisive populism, but it can also be leveraged for an inclusive populism, for reminding us of what we all have in common.
Well, thank you so much for being on. I can assure the listeners that this conversation only scratches the surface of the tribal story that's in the book. It is full of very rich examples and stories. I really enjoyed reading it, and I highly recommend it. Again, the name of the book is Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us can help bring us together. Thank you so much for being on, Michael Morris.
Well, Ryan, it's readers like you and your listeners who love to get into the science and love to think about the implications make writing a book like this worthwhile. So it's been really rewarding to talk to you and to hear about your podcast.
For more on Michael, pick up a copy of Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together, wherever books are sold. Or visit his website at michaelwmorris.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowedo-that-podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?